Point number 1. This strategy works even if your job requires lots of internet use and/or prompt email replies. If you're required to spend hours every day online or answer emails quickly, that's fine. This simply means that your internet blocks will be more numerous than those of someone whose job requires less connectivity. The total number or duration of your internet blocks doesn't matter nearly as much as making sure that the integrity of your offline blocks remains intact. Imagine, for example, that over a 2-hour period between meetings, you must schedule an email check every 15 minutes. Further imagine that these checks require, on average, 5 minutes. It's sufficient, therefore, to schedule an internet block every 15 minutes through this 2-hour stretch, with the rest of the time dedicated to offline blocks. In this example, you'll end up spending around 90 minutes out of this 2-hour period in a state where you're offline and actively resisting distraction. This works out to be a large amount of concentration training that's achieved without requiring you to sacrifice too much connectivity. Point number 2. Regardless of how you schedule your internet blocks, you must keep the time outside these blocks absolutely free from internet use. This objective is easy to state in principle, but quickly becomes tricky in the messy reality of the standard workday. An inevitable issue you'll face when executing this strategy is realizing early on in an offline block that there's some crucial piece of information online that you need to retrieve to continue making progress on your current task. If your next internet block doesn't start for a while, you might end up stuck. The temptation in this situation is to quickly give in, look up the information, then return to your offline block. You must resist this temptation. The internet is seductive. You may think you're just retrieving a single key email from your inbox, but you'll find it hard not to glance at the other urgent messages that have recently arrived. It doesn't take many of these exceptions before your mind begins to treat the barrier between internet and offline blocks as permeable, diminishing the benefits of this strategy. It's crucial in this situation, therefore, that you don't immediately abandon an offline block, even when stuck. If it's possible, switch to another offline activity for the remainder of the current block, or perhaps even fill in this time relaxing. If this is infeasible, perhaps you need to get the current offline activity done promptly, then the correct response is to change your schedule so that your next internet block begins sooner. The key in making this change, however, is to not schedule the next internet block to occur immediately. Instead, enforce at least a 5-minute gap between the current moment and the next time you can go online. This gap is minor, so it won't excessively impede your progress, but from a behavioralist perspective, it's substantial because it separates the sensation of wanting to go online from the reward of actually doing so. Point number 3. Scheduling internet use at home as well as at work can further improve your concentration training. If you find yourself glued to a smartphone or laptop throughout your evenings and weekends, then it's likely that your behavior outside of work is undoing many of your attempts during the workday to rewire your brain, which makes little distinction between the two settings. In this case, I would suggest that you maintain the strategy of scheduling internet use even after the workday is over. To simplify matters, when scheduling internet use after work, you can allow time-sensitive communication into your offline blocks, i.e., texting with a friend to agree on where you'll meet for dinner, as well as time-sensitive information retrieval, i.e., looking up the location of the restaurant on your phone. Outside of these pragmatic exceptions, however, when in an offline block, put your phone away, ignore texts, and refrain from internet usage. As in the workplace variation of this strategy, if the internet plays a large and important role in your evening entertainment, that's fine. Schedule lots of long internet blocks. The key here isn't to avoid or even to reduce the total amount of time you spend engaging in distracting behavior, but is instead to give yourself plenty of opportunities throughout your evening to resist switching to these distractions at the slightest hint of boredom. One place where this strategy becomes particularly difficult outside work is when you're forced to wait, for example, standing in line at a store. It's crucial in these situations that if you're in an offline block, you simply gird yourself for the temporary boredom and fight through it with only the company of your thoughts. To simply wait and be bored has become a novel experience in modern life. But from the perspective of concentration training, it's incredibly valuable. To summarize, to succeed with deep work, you must rewire your brain to be comfortable resisting distracting stimuli. This doesn't mean that you have to eliminate distracting behaviors. It's sufficient that you instead eliminate the ability of such behaviors to hijack your attention. The simple strategy proposed here of scheduling internet blocks goes a long way toward helping you regain this attention autonomy. Work like Teddy Roosevelt. If you attended Harvard College during the 1876-1877 school year, you would have likely noticed a wiry, mutton-chopped, brash, and impossibly energetic freshman named Theodore Roosevelt. If you then proceeded to befriend this young man, you would have soon noticed a paradox. On the one hand, his attention might appear to be hopelessly scattered, spread over what one classmate called an amazing array of interests, a list that biographer Edmund Morris catalogs to contain boxing, wrestling, bodybuilding, dance lessons, poetry readings, and the continuation of a lifelong obsession with naturalism. Roosevelt's landlord on Winthrop Street was not pleased with her young tenant's tendency to dissect and stuff specimens in his rented room. This latter interest developed to the point that Roosevelt published his first book, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks, in the summer after his freshman year. It was well received in the Bulletin of the Nuttall Ornithological Club, a publication, needless to say, which takes bird books quite seriously, and was good enough to lead Morris to assess Roosevelt at this young age to be one of the most knowledgeable young naturalists in the United States. To support this extracurricular exuberance, Roosevelt had to severely restrict the time left available for what should have been his primary focus, his studies at Harvard. Morris used Roosevelt's diary and letters from this period to estimate that the future president was spending no more than a quarter of the typical day studying. One might expect, therefore, that Roosevelt's grades would crater, but they didn't. He wasn't the top student in his class, but he certainly didn't struggle either. In his freshman year, he earned honor grades in 5 out of his 7 courses. The explanation for this Roosevelt paradox turns out to be his unique approach to tackling this schoolwork. Roosevelt would begin his scheduling by considering the 8 hours from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. He would then remove the time spent in recitation and classes, his athletic training, which was once a day, and lunch. The fragments that remained were then considered time dedicated exclusively to studying. As noted, These fragments didn't usually add up to a large number of total hours, but he would get the most out of them by working only on schoolwork during these periods, and doing so with a blistering intensity. The amount of time he spent at his desk was comparatively small, explained Morris, but his concentration was so intense and his reading so rapid that he could afford more time off from schoolwork than most. This strategy asks you to inject the occasional dash of Rooseveltian intensity into your own workday. In particular, identify a deep task, that is, something that requires deep work to complete, that's high on your priority list. Estimate how long you'd normally put aside for an obligation of this type. Then, give yourself a hard deadline that drastically reduces this time. If possible, commit publicly to the deadline. For example, by telling the person expecting the finished project when they should expect it. If this isn't possible, or if it puts your job in jeopardy, then motivate yourself by setting a countdown timer on your phone and propping it up where you can't avoid seeing it as you work. At this point, there should be only one possible way to get the deep task done in time: working with great intensity. No email breaks, no daydreaming, no Facebook browsing, no repeated trips to the coffee machine. Like Roosevelt at Harvard, attack the task with every free neuron until it gives way under your unwavering barrage of concentration. Try this experiment no more than once a week at first, giving your brain practice with intensity, but also giving it and your stress levels time to rest in between. Once you feel confident in your ability to trade concentration for completion time, increase the frequency of these Roosevelt dashes. Remember, however, to always keep your self-imposed deadlines right at the edge of feasibility. You should be able to consistently beat the buzzer, or at least be close, but to do so should require teeth-gritting concentration. The main motivation for this strategy is straightforward. Deep work requires levels of concentration well beyond where most knowledge workers are comfortable. Roosevelt dashes leverage artificial deadlines to help you systematically increase the level you can regularly achieve, providing in some sense interval training for the attention centers of your brain. An additional benefit is that these dashes are incompatible with distraction. There's no way you can give in to distraction and still make your deadlines. Therefore, every completed dash provides a session in which you're potentially bored and really want to seek more novel stimuli, but you resist. As argued in the previous strategy, the more you practice resisting such urges, the easier such resistance becomes. After a few months of deploying this strategy, your understanding of what it means to focus will likely be transformed as you reach levels of intensity stronger than anything you've experienced before. And if you're anything like a young Roosevelt, you can then repurpose the extra free time it generates toward the finer pleasures in life, like trying to impress the always discerning members of the Nuttall Ornithological Club. Meditate productively. During the 2 years I spent as a postdoctoral associate at MIT, my wife and I lived in a small but charming apartment on Pinckney Street in historic Beacon Hill. Though I lived in Boston and worked in Cambridge, the two locations were close, only a mile apart, sitting on opposite banks of the Charles River. Intent on staying fit, even during the long and dark New England winter, I decided to take advantage of this proximity by traveling between home and work to the greatest extent possible on foot. My routine had me walk to campus in the morning, crossing the Longfellow Bridge in all weather, The city, it turns out to my dismay, is often slow to shovel the pedestrian path after snowstorms. Around lunch, I would change into running gear and run back home on a longer path that followed the banks of the Charles, crossing at the Massachusetts Avenue Bridge. After a quick lunch and shower at home, I would typically take the subway across the river on the way back to campus, saving perhaps a third of a mile on the trek, and then walk home when the workday was done. In other words, I spent a lot of time on my feet during this period. It was this reality that led me to develop the practice that I'll now suggest you adopt in your own deep work training: productive meditation. The goal of productive meditation is to take a period in which you're occupied physically but not mentally, walking, jogging, driving, showering, and focus your attention on a single, well-defined professional problem. Depending on your profession, this problem might be outlining an article, writing a talk, making progress on a proof, or attempting to sharpen a business strategy. As in mindfulness meditation, you must continue to bring your attention back to the problem at hand when it wanders or stalls. I used to practice productive meditation in at least one of my daily cross-river treks while living in Boston, and as I improved, so did my results. I ended up, for example, working out the chapter outlines for a significant portion of my last book while on foot, and made progress on many knotty technical problems in my academic research. I suggest that you adopt a productive meditation practice in your own life. You don't necessarily need a serious session every day, but your goal should be to participate in at least 2 or 3 such sessions in a typical week. Fortunately, finding time for this strategy is easy, as it takes advantage of periods that would otherwise be wasted, such as walking the dog or commuting to work, and, if done right, can actually increase your professional productivity instead of taking time away from your work. In fact, you might even consider scheduling a walk during your workday specifically for the purpose of applying productive meditation to your most pressing problem at the moment. I'm not, however, suggesting this practice for its productivity benefits, though they're nice. I'm instead interested in its ability to rapidly improve your ability to think deeply. In my experience, productive meditation builds on both of the key ideas introduced at the beginning of this rule. By forcing you to resist distraction and return your attention repeatedly to a well-defined problem, it helps strengthen your distraction-resisting muscles. And by forcing you to push your focus deeper and deeper on a single problem, it sharpens your concentration. To succeed with productive meditation, it's important to recognize that, like any form of meditation, it requires practice to do well. When I first attempted this strategy back in the early weeks of my postdoc, I found myself hopelessly distracted, ending long stretches of thinking with little new to show for my efforts. It took me a dozen or so sessions before I began to experience real results. You should expect something similar, so patience will be necessary. To help accelerate this ramp-up process, however, I have 2 specific suggestions to offer. Suggestion number 1. Be wary of distractions and looping. As a novice, when you begin a productive meditation session, your mind's first act of rebellion will be to offer unrelated but seemingly more interesting thoughts. My mind, for example, was often successful at derailing my attention by beginning to compose an email that I knew I needed to write. Objectively speaking, this train of thought sounds exceedingly dull, but in the moment it can become impossibly tantalizing. When you notice your attention slipping away from the problem at hand, Gently remind yourself that you can return to that thought later. Then redirect your attention back. Distraction of this type, in many ways, is the obvious enemy to defeat in developing a productive meditation habit. A subtler but equally effective adversary is looping. When faced with a hard problem, your mind, as it was evolved to do, will attempt to avoid excess expenditure of energy when possible. One way it might attempt to sidestep this expenditure is by avoiding diving deeper into the problem by instead looping over and over again on what you already know about it. For example, when working on a proof, my mind has a tendency to rehash simple preliminary results again and again to avoid the harder work of building on these results toward the needed solution. You must be on your guard for looping, as it can quickly subvert an entire productive meditation session. When you notice it, remark to yourself that you seem to be in a loop. Then, redirect your attention toward the next step. Suggestion number 2. Structure your deep thinking. Thinking deeply about a problem seems like a self-evident activity, but in reality, it's not. When faced with a distraction-free mental landscape, a hard problem, and time to think, the next steps can become surprisingly non-obvious. In my experience, it helps to have some structure for this deep thinking process. I suggest starting with a careful review of the relevant variables for solving the problem, and then storing these values in your working memory. For example, if you're working on the outline for a book chapter, the relevant variables might be the main points you want to make in the chapter. If you're instead trying to solve a mathematics proof, these variables might be actual variables, or assumptions, or lemmas. Once the relevant variables are identified, define the specific next step question you need to answer using these variables. In the book chapter example, this next step question might be, how am I going to effectively open this chapter? And for a proof, it might be, what can go wrong if I don't assume this property holds? With the relevant variables stored and the next step question identified, you now have a specific target for your attention. Assuming you're able to solve your next step question, the final step of this structured approach to deep thinking is to consolidate your gains by reviewing clearly the answer you identified. At this point, you can push yourself to the next level of depth by starting the process over. This cycle of reviewing and storing variables, identifying and tackling the next step question, then consolidating your gains is like an intense workout routine for your concentration ability. It will help you get more out of your productive meditation sessions and accelerate the pace at which you improve your ability to go deep. Memorize a deck of cards. Given just 5 minutes, Daniel Kilov can memorize any of the following: a shuffled deck of cards, a string of 100 random digits, or 115 abstract shapes, this last feat establishing an Australian national record. It shouldn't be surprising, therefore, that Kilov recently won back-to-back silver medals in the Australian Memory Championships. What is perhaps surprising, given Kilov's history, is that he ended up a mental athlete at all. I wasn't born with an exceptional memory, Kilov told me. Indeed, during high school, he considered himself forgetful and disorganized. He also struggled academically and was eventually diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. It was after a chance encounter with Tansal Ali, one of the country's most successful and visible memory champions, that Kilov began to seriously train his memory. By the time he earned his college degree, he had won his first national competition medal. This transformation into a world-class mental athlete was rapid, but not unprecedented. In 2006, the American science writer Joshua Foer won the USA Memory Championship after only a year of intense training, a journey he chronicled in his 2011 bestseller, Moonwalking with Einstein. But what's important to us about Kilov's story is what happened to his academic performance during this period of intensive memory development. While training his brain, he went from a struggling student with attention deficit disorder to graduating from a demanding Australian university with first-class honors. He was soon accepted into the PhD program at one of the country's top universities, where he currently studies under a renowned philosopher. One explanation for this transformation comes from research led by Henry Roediger, who runs the Memory Lab at the University of Washington at St. Louis. In 2014, Roediger and his collaborators sent a team equipped with a battery of cognitive tests to the Extreme Memory Tournament held in San Diego. They wanted to understand what differentiated these elite memorizers from the population at large. We found that one of the biggest differences between memory athletes and the rest of us is in a cognitive ability that's not a direct measure of memory at all, but of attention, explained Roediger in a New York Times blog post. The ability in question is called attentional control, and it measures the subject's ability to maintain their focus on essential information. A side effect of memory training, in other words, is an improvement in your general ability to concentrate. This ability can then be fruitfully applied to any task demanding deep work. Daniel Kilov, we can therefore conjecture, didn't become a star student because of his award-winning memory. It was instead his quest to improve this memory that, incidentally, gave him the deep work edge needed to thrive academically. The strategy described here asks you to replicate a key piece of Kilov's training, and therefore gain some of the same improvements to your concentration. In particular, it asks you to learn a standard but quite impressive skill in the repertoire of most mental athletes: the ability to memorize a shuffled deck of cards. The technique for card memorization I'll teach you comes from someone who knows quite a bit about this particular challenge: Ron White, a former USA memory champion and world record holder in card memorization. The first thing White emphasizes is that professional memory athletes never attempt rote memorization. That is, where you simply look at information again and again, repeating it in your head. This approach to retention, though popular among burned-out students, misunderstands how our brains work. We're not wired to quickly internalize abstract information. We are, however, really good at remembering scenes. Think back to a recent memorable event in your life, perhaps attending the opening session of a conference or meeting a friend you haven't seen in a while for a drink. Try to picture the scene as clearly as possible. Most people in this scenario can conjure a surprisingly vivid recollection of the event, even though you made no special effort to remember it at the time. If you systematically counted the unique details in this memory, the total number of items would likely be surprisingly numerous. Your mind, in other words, can quickly retain lots of detailed information if it's stored in the right way. Ron White's card memorization technique builds on this insight. To prepare for this high-volume memorization task, White recommends that you begin by cementing in your mind the mental image of walking through 5 rooms in your home. Perhaps you come in the door, Walk through your front hallway, then turn into the downstairs bathroom. Walk out the door and enter the guest bedroom. Walk into the kitchen, and then head down the stairs into your basement. In each room, conjure a clear image of what you see. Once you can easily recall this mental walkthrough of a well-known location, fix in your mind a collection of 10 items in each of these rooms. White recommends that these items be large and therefore more memorable, like a desk, not a pencil. Next, establish an order in which you look at each of these items in each room. For example, in the front hallway, you might look at the entry mat, then shoes on the floor by the mat, then the bench above the shoes, and so on. Combined, this is only 50 items, so add 2 more items, perhaps in your backyard, to get to the full 52 items you'll later need when connecting these images to all the cards in a standard deck. Practice this mental exercise of walking through the rooms and looking at items in each room in a set order. You should find that this type of memorization, because it's based on visual images of familiar places and things, will be much easier than the rote memorizing you might remember from your school days. The second step in preparing to memorize a deck of cards is to associate a memorable person or thing with each of the 52 possible cards. To make this process easier, try to maintain some logical association between the card and the corresponding image. White provides the example of associating Donald Trump with the King of Diamonds, as diamonds signify wealth. Practice these associations until you can pull a card randomly from the deck and immediately recall the associated image. As before, the use of memorable visual images and associations will simplify the task of forming these connections. The 2 steps mentioned previously are advanced steps, things you do just once and can then leverage again and again in memorizing specific decks. Once these steps are done, you're ready for the main event, memorizing as quickly as possible the order of 52 cards in a freshly shuffled deck. The method here is straightforward. Begin your mental walkthrough of your house. As you encounter each item, look at the next card from the shuffled deck and imagine the corresponding memorable person or thing doing something memorable near that item. For example, if the first item in location is the mat in your front entry and the first card is the King of Diamonds, you might picture Donald Trump wiping mud off of his expensive loafers on the entry mat in your front hallway. Proceed carefully through the rooms, associating the proper mental images with objects in the proper order. After you complete a room, you might want to walk through it a few times in a row to lock in the imagery. Once you're done, you're ready to hand the deck to a friend and amaze him by rattling off the cards in order without peeking. To do so, of course, simply requires that you perform the mental walkthrough one more time, connecting each memorable person or thing to its corresponding card as you turn your attention to it. If you practice this technique, you'll discover, like many mental athletes who came before you, that you can eventually internalize a whole deck in just minutes. More important than your ability to impress friends, of course, is the training such activities provide your mind. Proceeding through the steps described earlier requires that you focus your attention again and again on a clear target. Like a muscle responding to weights, this will strengthen your general ability to concentrate, allowing you to go deeper with more ease. It's worth emphasizing, however, the obvious point that there's nothing special about card memorization. Any structured thought process that requires unwavering attention can have a similar effect. Be it studying the Talmud, like Adam Marlin from Rule Number 2's introduction, or practicing productive meditation, or trying to learn the guitar part of a song by ear, a past favorite of mine. If card memorization seems weird to you, in other words, then choose a replacement that makes similar cognitive requirements. The key to this strategy is not the specifics, but instead the motivating idea that your ability to concentrate is only as strong as your commitment to train it. Rule number 3. Quit social media. In 2013, author and digital media consultant Baratunde Thurston launched an experiment. He decided to disconnect from his online life for 25 days. No Facebook, no Twitter, no Foursquare, a service that awarded him Mayor of the Year in 2011. Not even email. He needed the break. Thurston, who is described by friends as the most connected man in the world, had, by his own count, participated in more than 59,000 Gmail conversations and posted 1,500 times on his Facebook wall in the year leading up to his experiment. "I was burnt out, fried, done, toast," he explained. We know about Thurston's experiment because he wrote about it in a cover article for Fast Company magazine, ironically titled #Unplug. As Thurston reveals in the article, it didn't take long to adjust to a disconnected life. By the end of that first week, the quiet rhythm of my days seemed far less strange, he said. I was less stressed about not knowing new things. I felt that I still existed despite not having shared documentary evidence of said existence on the internet. Thurston struck up conversations with strangers. He enjoyed food without Instagramming the experience. He bought a bike. Turns out it's easier to ride the thing when you're not trying to simultaneously check your Twitter. The end came too soon, Thurston lamented. But he had startups to run and books to market. So after the 25 days passed, he reluctantly reactivated his online presence. Baratunde Thurston's experiment neatly summarizes two important points about our culture's current relationship with social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and infotainment sites like Business Insider and BuzzFeed, two categories of online distraction that I will collectively call network tools in the sections ahead. The first point is that we increasingly recognize that these tools fragment our time and reduce our ability to concentrate. This reality no longer generates much debate. We all feel it. This is a real problem for many different people, but the problem is especially dire if you're attempting to improve your ability to work deeply. In the preceding rule, for example, I described several strategies to help you sharpen your focus. These efforts will become significantly more difficult if you simultaneously behave like a pre-experiment Baratunde Thurston, allowing your life outside such training to remain a distracted blur of apps and browser tabs. Willpower is limited, and therefore, the more enticing tools you have pulling at your attention, the harder it'll be to maintain focus on something important. To master the art of deep work, therefore, you must take back control of your time and attention from the many diversions that attempt to steal them. Before we begin fighting back against these distractions, however, we must better understand the battlefield. This brings me to the second important point summarized by Baratunde Thurston's story: the impotence with which knowledge workers currently discuss this problem of network tools and attention. Overwhelmed by these tools' demands on his time, Thurston felt that his only option was to, temporarily, quit the internet altogether. This idea that a drastic internet sabbatical is the only alternative to the distraction generated by social media and infotainment has increasingly pervaded our cultural conversation. The problem with this binary response to this issue is that these two choices are much too crude to be useful. The notion that you would quit the internet is, of course, an overstuffed straw man, infeasible for most, unless you're a journalist writing a piece about distraction. No one is meant to actually follow Baratunde Thurston's lead, and this reality provides justification for remaining with the only offered alternative, accepting our current distracted state as inevitable. For all the insight and clarity that Thurston gained during his internet sabbatical, for example, it didn't take him long once the experiment ended to slide back into the fragmented state where he began. On the day when I first started writing this chapter, which fell only 6 months after Thurston's article originally appeared in Fast Company, the Reformed Connector had already sent a dozen tweets in the few hours since he woke up. This rule attempts to break us out of this rut by proposing a third option, accepting that these tools are not inherently evil, and that some of them might be quite vital to your success and happiness. But, at the same time, also accepting that the threshold for allowing a site regular access to your time and attention, not to mention personal data, should be much more stringent, and that most people should therefore be using many fewer such tools. I won't ask you, in other words, to quit the internet altogether like Baratunde Thurston did for 25 days back in 2013. But I will ask you to reject the state of distracted hyperconnectedness that drove him to that drastic experiment in the first place. There is a middle ground. And if you're interested in developing a deep work habit, you must fight to get there. Our first step toward finding this middle ground in network tool selection is to understand the current default decision process deployed by most internet users. In the fall of 2013, I received insight into this process because of an article I wrote explaining why I never joined Facebook. Though the piece was meant to be explanatory and not accusatory, it nonetheless put many readers on the defensive, leading them to reply with justifications for their use of the service. Here are some examples of these justifications. Entertainment was my initial draw to Facebook. I can see what my friends are up to and post funny photos, make quick comments. When I first joined, I didn't know why. By mere curiosity, I joined a forum of short fiction stories. Once there, I improved my writing and made very good friends. I use Facebook because a lot of people I knew in high school are on there. Here's what strikes me about these responses, which are representative of the large amount of feedback I received on this topic. They're surprisingly minor. I don't doubt, for example, that the first commenter from this list finds some entertainment in using Facebook. But I would also assume that this person wasn't suffering some severe deficit of entertainment options before he or she signed up for the service. I would further wager that this user would succeed in staving off boredom even if the service were suddenly shut down. Facebook, at best, added one more, arguably quite mediocre, entertainment option to many that already existed. Another commenter cited making friends in a writing forum. I don't doubt the existence of these friends, but we can assume that these friendships are lightweight, given that they're based on sending short messages back and forth over a computer network. There's nothing wrong with such lightweight friendships, but they're unlikely to be at the center of this user's social life. Something similar can be said about the commenter who reconnected with high school friends. This is a nice diversion, but hardly something central to his or her sense of social connection or happiness. To be clear, I'm not trying to denigrate the benefits identified previously. There's nothing illusory or misguided about them. What I'm emphasizing, however, is that these benefits are minor and somewhat random. By contrast, if you'd instead asked someone to justify the use of, say, the World Wide Web more generally, or email, the arguments would become much more concrete and compelling. To this observation, you might reply that value is value. If you can find some extra benefit in using a service like Facebook, even if it's small, then why not use it? I call this way of thinking the any benefit mindset, as it identifies any possible benefit as sufficient justification for using a network tool. In more detail, the any benefit approach to network tool selection. You're justified in using a network tool if you can identify any possible benefit to its use, or anything you might possibly miss out on if you don't use it. The problem with this approach, of course, is that it ignores all the negatives that come along with the tools in question. These services are engineered to be addictive, robbing time and attention from activities that more directly support your professional and personal goals, such as deep work. Eventually, if you use these tools enough, you'll arrive at the state of burned-out, hyper-distracted connectivity that plagued Baratunde Thurston and millions of others like him. It's here that we encounter the true insidious nature of an any-benefit mindset. The use of network tools can be harmful. If you don't attempt to weigh pros against cons, but instead use any glimpse of some potential benefit as justification for unrestrained use of a tool, then you're unwittingly crippling your ability to succeed in the world of knowledge work. This conclusion, if considered objectively, shouldn't be surprising. In the context of network tools, we've become comfortable with the any benefit mindset. But if we instead zoom out and consider this mindset in the broader context of skilled labor, it suddenly seems a bizarre and ahistorical approach to choosing tools. In other words, once you put aside the revolutionary rhetoric surrounding all things Internet, the sense summarized in Part 1 that you're either fully committed to the revolution or a Luddite curmudgeon, you'll soon realize that network tools are not exceptional. They're tools, no different from a blacksmith's hammer or an artist's brush, used by skilled laborers to do their jobs better, and occasionally to enhance their leisure. Throughout history, skilled laborers have applied sophistication and skepticism to their encounters with new tools and their decisions about whether to adopt them. There's no reason why knowledge workers cannot do the same when it comes to the Internet. The fact that the skilled labor here now involves digital bits doesn't change this reality. To help understand what this more careful tool curation might look like, it makes sense to start by talking to someone who makes a living working with non-digital tools and relies on a complex relationship with these tools to succeed. Fortunately, for our purposes, I found just such an individual in a lanky English major turned successful, sustainable farmer named, almost too aptly, Forrest Pritchard. Forrest Pritchard runs Smith Meadows, a family farm located an hour west of D.C., one of many farms clustered in the valleys of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Soon after taking control of the land from his parents, as I learned, Pritchard moved the operation away from traditional monoculture crops and toward the then novel concept of grass-finished meat. The farm bypasses wholesaling. You cannot find Smith Meadows steaks in Whole Foods. to sell direct to consumers at the bustling farmers markets in the Washington, D.C. metro area. By all accounts, the farm is thriving in an industry that rarely rewards small operations. I first encountered Pritchard at our local farmers market in Tacoma Park, Maryland, where the Smith Meadows stand does good business. To see Pritchard, usually standing a foot taller than most of his suburbanite customers, wearing the obligatory faded flannel of the farmer, is to see a craftsman confident in his trade. I introduced myself to him because farming is a skill dependent on the careful management of tools, and I wanted to understand how a craftsman in a non-digital field approaches this crucial task. Haymaking is a good example, he told me not long into one of our conversations on the topic. It's a subject where I can give you the basic idea without having to gloss over the underlying economics. When Pritchard took over Smith Meadows, he explained, the farm made its own hay to use as animal feed during the winter months when grazing is impossible. Haymaking is done with a piece of equipment called a hay baler, a device you pull behind a tractor that compresses and binds dried grass into bales. If you raise animals on the East Coast, there's an obvious reason to own and operate a hay baler. Your animals need hay. Why spend money to buy in feed when you have perfectly good grass growing for free right in your own soil? If a farmer subscribed to the any benefit approach used by knowledge workers, therefore, he would definitely buy a hay baler. But, as Pritchard explained to me after preemptively apologizing for a moment of snark, if a farmer actually adopted such a simplistic mindset, I'd be counting the days until the forced sale goes up on the property. Pritchard, like most practitioners of his trade, instead deploys a more sophisticated thought process when assessing tools. And after applying this process to the hay baler, Pritchard was quick to sell it. Smith Meadows now purchases all the hay it uses. Here's why. Let's start by exploring the costs of making hay, Pritchard said. First, there's the actual cost of fuel and repairs and the shed to keep the baler. You also have to pay taxes on it. These directly measurable costs, however, were the easy part of his decision. It was instead the opportunity costs that required more attention. As he elaborated, if I make hay all summer, I can't be doing something else. For example, I now use that time instead to raise broilers, chickens meant for eating. These generate positive cash flow because I can sell them. But they also produce manure, which I can then use to enhance my soil. Then there's the equally subtle issue of assessing the secondary value of a purchased bale of hay. As Pritchard explained, when I'm buying in hay, I'm trading cash for animal protein as well as manure once it passes through the animal system, which means I'm also getting more nutrients from my land in exchange for my money. I'm also avoiding compacting soils by driving heavy machinery over my ground all summer long. When making his final decision on the baler, Pritchard moved past the direct monetary costs, which were essentially a wash, and instead shifted his attention to the more nuanced issue of the long-term health of his fields. For the reasons described previously, Pritchard concluded that buying in hay results in healthier fields, and as he summarized, soil fertility is my baseline. By this calculation, the baler had to go. Notice the complexity of Pritchard's tool decision. This complexity underscores an important reality. The notion that identifying some benefit is sufficient to invest money, time, and attention in a tool is near laughable to people in his trade. Of course, a hay baler offers benefits. Every tool at the farm supply store has something useful to offer. At the same time, of course, it offers negatives as well. Pritchard expected this decision to be nuanced. He began with a clear baseline, in his case that soil health is of fundamental importance to his professional success, and then built off this foundation toward a final call on whether to use a particular tool. I propose that if you're a knowledge worker, especially one interested in cultivating a deep work habit, you should treat your tool selection with the same level of care as other skilled workers, such as farmers. Following is my attempt to generalize this assessment strategy. I call it the craftsman approach to tool selection, a name that emphasizes that tools are ultimately aids to the larger goals of one's craft. The craftsman approach to tool selection. Identify the core factors that determine success and happiness in your professional and personal life. Adopt a tool only if its positive impacts on these factors substantially outweigh its negative impacts. Notice that this craftsman approach to tool selection stands in opposition to the any-benefit approach. Whereas the any-benefit mindset identifies any potential positive impact as justification for using a tool, the craftsman variant requires that these positive impacts affect factors at the core of what's important to you, and that they outweigh the negatives. Even though the craftsman approach rejects the simplicity of the any-benefit approach, it doesn't ignore the benefits that currently drive people to network tools, or make any advanced proclamations about what's good or bad technology. It simply asks that you give any particular network tool the same type of measured, nuanced accounting that tools in other trades have been subjected to throughout the history of skilled labor. The three strategies that follow in this rule are designed to grow your comfort with abandoning the any-benefit mindset and instead applying the more thoughtful craftsman philosophy in curating the tools that lay claim to your time and attention. This guidance is important because the craftsman approach is not cut and dry. Identifying what matters most in your life and then attempting to assess the impacts of various tools on these factors doesn't reduce to a simple formula. This task requires practice and experimentation. The strategies that follow provide some structure for this practice and experimentation by forcing you to reconsider your network tools from many different angles. Combined, they should help you cultivate a more sophisticated relationship with your tools that will allow you to take back enough control over your time and attention to enable the rest of the ideas in Part 2 to succeed. Apply the law of the vital few to your internet habits. Malcolm Gladwell doesn't use Twitter. In a 2013 interview, he explained why. "Who says my fans want to hear from me on Twitter?" He then joked, "I know a lot of people would like to see less of me." Michael Lewis, another mega best-selling author, also doesn't use the service, explaining in The Wire, "I don't tweet, I don't Twitter. I couldn't even tell you how to read or where to find a Twitter message." And as mentioned in Part 1, the award-winning New Yorker scribe George Packer also avoids the service, and indeed only recently even succumbed to the necessity of owning a smartphone. These three writers don't think Twitter is useless. They're quick to accept that other writers find it useful. Packer's admission of non-Twitter use, in fact, was written as a response to an unabashedly pro-Twitter article by the New York Times media critic David Carr, a piece in which Carr effused, "And now, nearly a year later, has Twitter turned my brain to mush? No, I'm in narrative on more things in a given moment than I ever thought possible. And instead of spending a half-hour surfing in search of illumination, I get a sense of the day's news and how people are reacting to it in the time that it takes to wait for coffee at Starbucks. At the same time, however, Gladwell, Lewis, and Packer don't feel like the service offers them nearly enough advantages to offset its negatives in their particular circumstances. Lewis, for example, worries that adding more accessibility will sap his energy and reduce his ability to research and write great stories, noting, "It's amazing how overly accessible people are. There's a lot of communication in my life that's not enriching. It's impoverishing." While Packer, for his part, worries about distraction, saying, "Twitter is crack for media addicts." He goes so far as to describe Carr's rave about the service as the most frightening picture of the future that I've read thus far in the new decade. We don't have to argue about whether these authors are right in their personal decisions to avoid Twitter and similar tools, because their sales numbers and awards speak for themselves. We can, instead, use these decisions as a courageous illustration of the craftsman approach to tool selection in action. In a time when so many knowledge workers, and especially those in creative fields, are still trapped in the any-benefit mindset, it's refreshing to see a more mature approach to sorting through such services. But the very rareness of these examples reminds us that mature and confident assessments of this type aren't easy to make. Recall the complexity of the thought process highlighted earlier that Forrest Pritchard had to slog through to make a decision on his hay baler. For many knowledge workers and many of the tools in their lives, these decisions will be equally complex. The goal of this strategy, therefore, is to offer some structure to this thought process, a way to reduce some of the complexity of deciding which tools really matter to you.